Well, welcome back, guys. You've already had that. It must be nice to sit there and know you're not about to be force graded as well. Yeah, I can relate to that. So what I'm here to talk about today, I'm going to revisit the global financial crisis. And so there's a few reasons why. So when I was asked to have something to say to the alumni, this was front of my mind for a few reasons. So firstly, I think particularly in Australia, the crisis passed us by without a real sense of how close the world went to the financial precipice. Having worked in the financial markets in the lead up, I had a really good look at how close the interbank markets went to complete freeze. And if that had have persisted for a long time, the international economy would have ground to a halt. And the events of 2008, particularly the September of that month, were just really, really critical to avoiding an absolute calamity. So what I'm trying to do here is convey to you a sense that, yeah, we missed a massive financial shock. We had one, but it could have been a lot worse. But as you know, as senior leaders, that without a sense that there was a massive crisis just passed us by, it's often hard to motivate people to change significantly in the way they do things. And hence I want to impress upon you, hey, we just missed a big bullet here, and maybe we need to revisit our thinking. And I'm going to attack that from a few angles, but particularly incentives and executive compensation is my main angle on asking us to rethink how we do things. So yeah, segue to exec comp and incentive compensation. And what I want to do is I really want this group of people to be really well informed in terms of what happened with the financial crisis and what has happened since with regulatory change and changes in the workplace. And why is that important? Well, as a group of well-informed individuals, you're very well placed to shape opinion of those around you and those in the workplace to try and improve our chances of avoiding a bullet again. So firstly, let me just go through a few things in the lead up. You might have read or heard a bit about this, but what I want to do is just take you through the lead up to the financial crisis. So what actually happened here? So you probably read to some degree about all of this, but obviously it was all about the US residential mortgage market initially. So unsold homes goes through the roof slowly. Obviously the sales price starts to come down, but they're the smallest graphs, but just have a look at these for the most important ones. So let's say you're the chief risk officer at an investment bank, and your task is to keep an eye out for metrics that might indicate what kind of a trading position you need to do or take, and what kind of trades you need to unwind. So looking at these over here, so this is the end of 2006. So I'm just going to take you through the fates of a couple of different investment banks and how they read this data differently. So Goldman Sachs, there was a really good article in the New York Times in 2007, and it spoke about a meeting that took place in December 2006. So here's December 2006. So you've seen this little spike here in the what's that, delinquency defaults on mortgages. So what's happened there is there's been an early signal that something's going wrong in the residential property market in the US. So you've had this going on for a while. You've had this inventory of unsold homes. So there had been some signals out there. But the massive challenge for you as leaders, and particularly in the banking world, you get so much data, You've got it all there in front of you. The question is, how do I interpret this? So back to Goldman Sachs. So December 2006, the CFO calls a meeting of the head of fixed income and the head of residential mortgage trading, and he says to them, "Look, I've noticed a few stats here," and this was the one he was pointing to most. And there was some great data from HSBC at the time that he was on top of. And so he got a group of 12 traders from their structured finance department and said to them, right, one, we want to unwind our exposure to subprime mortgages. And two, we want to look for every opportunity to short this market. Anyone who's willing to take a bet on the other side of that, we're going to absolutely wipe them. And fortunately, there were banks out there like UBS, Citigroup, Merrill at that stage, who were still happy to be on the other side of these bets. And so that group of 12 traders worked around the clock basically for the next couple of months. And the trades they put in place made about $9 billion in the first half of 2007. Now, so that's first half of 2007, right? So 7 months later, so July 2007, UBS are still looking for ways to expand their portfolio of subprime mortgages. And pretty well the same. Citigroup, Bank of America was still insuring assets linked to the American subprime market. So you had some real different approaches there. And you might argue that, you know, there's the theory here that if you're late to get into a market or a particular technology, that you're probably not going to be mastering it as well as those that got in early. So who got in early here? Well, Goldman Sachs were one of the early ones. Merrill Lynch were one of the early ones, and they went really badly. So they just kept milking it all the way through 2007. So first half of 2007, Goldman's up $9 billion. By the end of 2007, UBS are down $40 billion. And this is kind of an interesting segue to this compensation debate, you know. So you've got a CFO. So the difference in CFOs, UBS, Goldman Sachs. So one has instigated a meeting that has arguably saved losing $40 billion and made $9 billion. So, you know, he's up $50 billion on his personal P&L. Now, would you pay that bloke another $10 million to be a CFO? And so that's the beginning. And I'm going to go into that in a lot more depth, this whole executive compensation, do we justify it or not? But one way to view it is the marginal importance, or what difference that executive can make. And certainly in the middle of the 2000s, there was a lot of difference to be made. I remember I went to a meeting in the middle of 2006. The head of leveraged finance at Credit Suisse was there, and I remember him saying that, look, we've just been through this period of just amazing slack monetary policy the world over. You know, there's liquidity everywhere, money's looking for yield everywhere. He said the next time the credit cycle unwinds, it's going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. And so with that in mind, I thought Credit Suisse would have done better in terms of positioning, but he was up against some political hurdles. So you've got guys in the room. So you imagine the head of the trading committee at Credit Suisse. You got the naysayer, which was that guy, saying, hey, hang on, we need to slow down, we need to unwind our positions, our exposures to subprime credit. And then you got a bloke in the room who's been making massive cash over the last 5 years for the bank. So here's the guy who's head of mortgage-backed securities. He has the power in that room because he's had the best P&L for the last 5 years. And that dictated power in an investment bank. Probably still does, but certainly did through that period. So he's there saying, hang on, everyone else is still making money here. And there's a great quote by the CEO of Citigroup where they said to him, someone said to him in early 2007, hey, maybe there's some signs here that this crazy period of credit growth and everyone making money, maybe it's going to come to an end. And Chuck Prince said, I'm going to keep dancing until the music stops. You know? So it kind of summed it up. You know, like everyone's making money here. My shareholders, my institutional investors who sit on my board are giving me stick because I'm not in the middle of that party. And that happened with UBS. UBS stayed out of this for a long time. Came into it sort of 2005, 2006, with the CEO saying to the trading desk, hey, why aren't we making this money Merrill Lynch are, you know? Merrill Lynch are creaming it, you know, Goldman Sachs is doing all right. We need to get into the subprime space. So there's the differences in opinions. And if you're trying to water it down and say, you know, what did we learn? What can you learn as managers from these experiences? There's a few things here. One is the value of analysing data and analysing the right data. And another one is just looking, so just in terms of the team dynamics. So having sat in on a lot of risk meetings, and during that period up to 2007, so I was a risk guy, right? Operational risk guy. I like to stay out of the market risk stuff. But so often, you know, I'd see a situation where you'd need a trader to do something quite basic, to fulfill some basic control. And he would say to you, so say for instance you were going to block a trade with a particular counterparty because you didn't like them as a credit risk. So often during that period, the guy in trading would say, if you don't sign this, I'm going to fire you, or I'm going to get my CEO to fire you, and I'm going to bring someone in who's going to sign this. So that kind of thing was going on. So I first started out with, I first worked with Credit Suisse in '96. So, did the standard backpacking around Europe thing after I finished my chartered accounting, and rocked up in London. And they were the glory days. I remember I got there on a Tuesday, called up a recruitment consultant, and I started at Credit Suisse on the Thursday. And it was just rolling. And a mate of mine... Yeah, nothing's changed. But I had a mate, and he was actually a Kiwi bloke who I hadn't previously met. And I met him backpacking around, and he got to London, and I said, look, how about I introduce you to my boss, you might get a job here. So in the interview, his boss said to him, or potential boss said to him, can you tell us how you might hedge a swap trade? And he said, yeah, don't know. And so he dumbed it down a bit, and he said, okay, can you tell us what a swap is? And he said, no, don't know. He got the job. Kid you not. So the crazy days of the 90s. So just a few more graphs to depict the enormity of what happened in the lead up to that crisis in terms of accumulation of credit. So you've had this period where, so the 40s and 50s, I guess it was the Puritan values, like this whole American ethos back then of no debt, the manager must come from the shop floor, very conservative, and then up she goes. And this golden period of the 2000s where, as I keep saying, there was plenty of cash around. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two big mortgage providers in the US, their mission was to increase home ownership in the US. And that came at the cost of the credit worthiness of people who were receiving the mortgages. So what happened? So the thin red line there is the value of housing in the US. So as you can see, the growth of that way outstripped GDP. But it did in the UK as well. So if I look at this graph, I go, well, so why didn't the UK have the kind of collapse that the US had? And it comes down to supply and demand dynamics. So the US were building houses in parts of America where they were never going to have the population to fill it. And there's a few other factors at play as well, like it's easier to walk away from a mortgage if it's underwater in the US. So a few more explanatory factors. And same in Ireland and Spain. In 2006 I went to a mortgage conference, believe it or not, with there was an Irish economist. And no, this isn't a joke. But he presented all this data on supply and demand for different mortgage markets. And so in the UK, he said, look, the UK is going to be a good bet going out 10 years because of the fact there's just a limited supply in central London. And whereas in Dublin and Spain, he just had all these stats in terms of look at what supply is doing and look at projected population growth. And so my takeaway from that is, regardless of the market, if you're trying to work out, have we got a genuine bubble here, probably a good thing to have a look at supply and demand. And for the Melbourne market, there's some really good stats you can get actually. If you just go and Google Melbourne residential supply and demand for the rental market and the domestic market, and you can see these projections if you're trying to hedge your own bets or decide whether your own investments are good or not. Yeah, so there we go. As you can see, you've got the value of the mortgages just outstripping the equity to the tune of that's almost $1 trillion. So say $800 billion or so. So someone's wearing that loss, and it was the banks. And $800 billion was about the value of the TARP funds that were approved. I'll get to that in a moment as well. Righto, so just to map out exactly what happened here, you had subprime mortgage. So you define subprime as in it's gone to someone who probably doesn't have the creditworthiness to deserve it, or it's gone to someone who hasn't provided the paperwork, so the light mortgages, hasn't provided the paperwork to substantiate their income. So why would you do that is the big question. but it was going on hand over fist, and I'll come back to that in a moment as well. So you had these mortgage-backed securities, and that's where you'd get a portfolio of mortgages, you'd tranche it up, you know, so based on expected default rates, you'd give a certain portion of that a AAA, a portion triple B plus or whatever, and then you'd sell it off to investors. And you had, so at that stage you had maybe 13 firms in the world that had AAA status for their bonds, but you had thousands of mortgage-backed securities that had AAA status. And by that, so AAA, and at this stage AAA investments were yielding about 6%. So that's gold, you know. Like if you look at what Standard & Poor's are telling me, AAA, it's like a less than a 1% chance of default, and I can get 6% on it. So this was the mentality at the time, pile in, you know. And so when UBS, for instance, would take that tranche, so they'd buy the portfolios from some Midwest bank, they'd go, hang on, so we're going to sell off 90% of this, but the top 10%, hey, it's AAA and it's yielding 6%. We're going to leave that on our balance sheet. So there were the mortgage-backed securities. You had the investment banks on board. Collateralised debt obligation, it's another way of saying it really. So they generally keep these off their balance sheets and sell it on, but quite often, and as happened with Merrill and UBS, they hung on to a fair bit of it, kept it on the balance sheet, and that brought them unstuck. And then you had these wise insurers, so AIG on the sideline there. So if you're one of these folks, and say you got uncomfortable with your exposure to the subprime market, you'd go to AIG and say, can you give me some insurance against default on this? And AIG, some of the quotes that were going on in boardrooms there during that lead up to 2008, you know, they had no data at all. They weren't monitoring the delinquency rates. They weren't keeping an eye on that risk that, and that, because they were making great money for a long time, you know. Hey, we're insuring the stuff where nothing defaults. Yeah, it was just too good to be true. So, yeah, special purpose vehicle, it was another way of putting these off your balance sheet until you sold it. And off to the investors, which included municipalities, schools, all sorts of naive investors. And as it's, like there was a court case in the last couple of weeks, actually, a Goldman's trader, I don't know if you saw this, who had been found guilty of selling a sophisticated product, so a subprime linked product to unsophisticated investors, basically in the knowledge that there were other people in the bank who were betting against it. And there's a few different players that are guilty of this, and there's a feeling that that might be the beginning of a lot of prosecutions. Given what happened with, say, the Enron collapse, where the CEO got like 25 years, or before he died before he started that sentence, and the CFO got 22, and you know, so given that happened, it's kind of hard to believe that, given the enormity of what happened here, that there's been no one going to jail for 20 years plus as well. Anyway, so watch that space.
Excuse me, is there a law, even though the bank hasn't got a position against it, is there a law knowing it's about to tank, say the next day or the day after? Is there a law against just dumping it or knowing it's actually shit's going to hit the bank?
No, there's no law against dumping. I think the legality there is that if you knowingly sell a product to an investor, if you sell a product to an investor and take a bet on the other side that that product is going to tank, that's what gets you into trouble. And I don't know the finer detail of that law, but yeah, there's a lot of senators kind of lining up to find ways to prosecute bankers at the moment for that kind of thing. Yeah, so this was the big month, September 2008. So I'd cleared out about 7 months before this. So in December 2007, it's a good way to go. In December 2007, I got accepted in the PhD program, and I went to my boss and said, you know, is there any chance of a package? It'd be good if I could leave without resigning, you know. I was after redundancy, and he said to me, oh, not sure, see what I can do. Anyway, 2 weeks later, our whole team was made redundant, like 30 of us globally, and so it was just golden for me. And we had to line up and go in. So this is how it works at the banks. You're told that your team's redundant. You've got until lunchtime to pack your stuff up, and there's a security guy standing there, make sure you will. And so we had to we had our appointments with HR to go in, and they'd give us our papers and tell you how much you were going to get or whatever. Anyway, so there'd been a lot of tears and anger basically that morning. People really upset that they'd lost their jobs, which is fair enough. And so I went into HR, and there's two ladies sitting there, and you could tell they were ready for another conflict. And I was trying my best to put them at ease, and I wasn't quite sure how to explain to them that this is one of the best things that's ever happened to me. and so they had their script, and it was, you know, due to market conditions and restructuring. And I said, "Oh, excuse me, ladies, is that the number?" So there was a piece of paper there in front of me. They said, "Yep." And they kind of looked at one another a little bit flustered, and off they went again. And I said, "Excuse me, ladies, do I need to be in the country during that 4 months?" So you had this gardening leave. And they said, "No." And I said, "Thank you, that's all I need to know." And I got out, and I remember walking out, because I was heading straight to the travel agent. And as I was walking out, I was going like that, and I just kind of remembered myself that there were people distraught that they'd lost their jobs. But I had a good crisis. It was great. So watching from the sidelines, here's what happened in 2008. So basically in March, prior to this, Bear Stearns was kind of bailed out in that the government convinced JP Morgan Chase to acquire them, but the government was going to underwrite 30 billion of their debt. And so people thought that saving Bear Stearns was, we missed a bullet, you know. We're going to miss that big sort of interbank freeze up that we thought would happen. But then comes September. So it started when Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, as I said, their mission was to ensure as many Americans own their homes as possible. So they were the first to go, and that was about, the American taxpayer is probably going to swallow about 140 billion worth of losses on that particular bailout. So Merrill Lynch, again, when Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America, people were thinking, oh, whew, you know, if there's another bullet we missed, we might be all right here. And then you had this decision of, so it was on the cards that Lehman Brothers and AIG were going broke. So the question was, who do we bail out? There's a really good book, well, there's quite a few good books on this, but I read most of them during the course of my PhD. And anyway, so one issue here was, right, you've got this political faction saying we don't want to appear to be in bed with the banks. And Paulson, was he the Treasury Secretary? Anyway, so Paulson, who was pulling the strings politically at the time, ex-Goldman Sachs CEO, and so the Republican Party were trying to not make it look like they were investing in the banks. And there's long been this perception that Goldman Sachs is looked after by the Treasury. So there was a bit of a political hot potato. But in the end, what they've done, so they gave this big bailout to AIG, and AIG was seen as really systemically important because they were so in, you know, because they'd basically underwritten about 150 billion worth of subprime debt. So if they had let them go broke, a lot of banks would have followed. So it was seen as important to bail them, but not Lehman's, you know. And so I've seen some transcripts with Paulson since where he said, we didn't expect that failing to bail Lehman's would result in the knock-on that took place. So once Lehman went, that was the beginning of the interbank market freeze that followed. So no one was lending money to anyone, and it was really, really ugly. Now, it's open to debate here whether Paulson was the right man for the job at the time, but look, having read a lot about this, I really think that Paulson was, if we didn't have or if the US didn't have Paulson in place at that point in time, what Paulson did was got all the CEOs of the investment banks in one room one day there and said, you're all going to accept a bailout. You know, and if you had some sort of career bureaucrat, he wouldn't have had the legitimacy to get those people in that room and say that. And why was it important for all the banks to accept a bailout at once? If one had taken one singularly, it would have appeared that it would have been a sign of weakness. There would have been a run on that bank. And so to maintain confidence in the banking system as a whole, Paulson said to all the CEOs, you're all going to sign here before you leave. And they had the paper that worked there ready to go. They all had to accept cash injections of, you know, somewhere between 20 and 80 billion, depending on who it was. So there it went, and Washington Mutual, there's a book about the collapse of Washington Mutual. The CEO of that, like Washington Mutual had a very proud history, and there was a CEO who had just been old school, had stayed away from anything speculative, really big on strong bank lending standards. And then when he left, they thought they'd bring in someone more aggressive in the 90s, and anyway, it was really sad. So what was passed there was the TARP funds. So the TARP funds was, they agreed that $800 billion will be put aside to purchase mortgage-related assets. And there are a lot of guarantees put in place, etc. But this was emergency, like all hand decks on to the guns. So everyone was on board, just trying really hard to pump cash into the system to try and continue to allow banks to lend to businesses that actually had a strong cash flow and that were worthy of keeping afloat. And on a lot of those investments, so they've unwound their position. The US government has unwound their position in AIG. They end up putting 180 billion into AIG, but they've got all that back plus 20 billion. And in terms of all the funds, so almost all of that 800 billion was used at some point. And the net loss to the US taxpayer will probably be less than, say, 50 billion, which isn't bad, given that at the time they were thinking 800 billion gone. So the net effect for the US taxpayer wasn't so bad in the end. So there we go. So what I want to go through now, so having established what happened and the enormity of what nearly happened. So sure, we had a freeze of that, the interbank market, and economies tanked all around the world. You know, stock markets lost about 10 to 20% in a week. So a lot of bad things happened. But what I'm trying to get across is it could have been a lot worse. So say they froze, say banks stopped lending to one another, in this case, pretty well entirely for a few weeks and almost entirely for a couple of months. And that's bad, obviously, right? But it could have been a lot worse, is my point. If we hadn't have got all the banks to accept a bailout, if the government hadn't have passed that $800 billion worth of TARP funds, it could have been a lot worse for the global economy. So with that in mind, I want to just go through now, so what has happened from a regulatory perspective since to try and prevent this happening? Because obviously something was broken there. And a lot of people have pointed the finger at Alan Greenspan, you know, the man who had the keys to the global economy. Like, he was probably the most influential banker during that golden period. And he's said publicly that he's just let too much laissez-faire take place. So he was very big on the idea of, we're not here to regulate the banks. We're not here to stop the development of asset bubbles. My only role is to keep an eye on inflation. That's the role of the investment bank, of the Fed. And so obviously that didn't work. So the question that I want you guys to think about is, okay, so that didn't work. So what do we need to do as a society and as business leaders to try and make sure we don't hit that precipice again? Right, so banking regulation. So what's happened here? So Basel III. So Basel is all about capital standards. It's about trying to make sure that banks hold enough capital so that when things go bad in the economy, they've got a cushion to fall back on, so they don't have to go to the taxpayer. So that's been upped quite significantly, and it's going slowly, so up from 2% to 4.5%, this proportion of risk-weighted assets. But the problem with having a proportion of risk-weighted assets is that that's pretty easy to fudge. You can recategorise all sorts of things. There's a lot of grey involved. I once, as a former auditor, worked in a Basel implementation team, and I was just staggered at how much scope the bank had to reclassify things that hit that number. And so what are they trying to do about that? So that's to 2015, and they're adding another 2.5% from by 2019. So that's good, you know. So it's going to go from 2% to eventually 7%. And the idea being, as I keep saying, that if there's another massive unwind of a credit cycle, you don't have to go to the taxpayer. But this is what they're trying to do to get away from the problems associated with the ambiguity of risk-weighted assets, so these leverage ratios. So here they just use total assets. And any accountant or auditor will tell you that it's pretty easy to manipulate, to some degree, the total assets number as well. But it's less easy to manipulate than risk-weighted assets. So that's going to be 3%. And that's a problem. Like a third of the major banks that were surveyed in the last couple of months said they're going to have real trouble hitting that number by the end of this year. So Barclays, for instance, is at 2.2%. They're about to go to the market for another $6 billion. Interestingly, the American banks, actually, they were forced to do this back in 2009, 2010, which was good because their equity was cheaper then, so it was cheaper to raise cash. So interestingly, the US investment banks have better balance sheets than most banks throughout the rest of the developed world. The Europeans are the sick banks, particularly the German banks. The British banks less so, but they're still generally undercapitalised relative to the Americans. Australia is on board with this BAL, so this whole idea, 4.5, 2.5. USA is trying to push for a 6% leverage, and I say has introduced, so that's still in the process of being approved, but it's looking like it's going to go through. Dodd-Frank. So this was supposed to be the legislation that was going to make sure we never had another September 2008. So these two senators got together. And what transpired, so I was watching this really closely when they were talking about what was going to be in it. And it was really interesting how they started with this really lofty goal, you know, so all those taxes associated with financial transactions, you know, banks were going to be taxed for the fact that their deposit base was being implicitly guaranteed. And so much of it just went, you know, as the Wall Street lobby kept piling in. And it was really, I found it really disappointing. And look, this is a symptom of the democratic system we have. You know, as Churchill said, democracy is better than all those other systems that have been tried from time to time. But it just really frustrated me watching Dodd-Frank just erode and erode and erode. And I remember at the 11th hour, like the day before it was going to be signed, another $40 billion annual tax was wiped off, you know, as the congressman kept entertaining the lobby group of Wall Street. The Wall Street lobby is one of the most powerful lobbies in the world. And look, you probably don't need me to tell you this, but like the return on investment of lobbying in the US is just ridiculous, you know, like there's been a lot of studies on this. Anyway, so where did we get to? So Dodd-Frank consolidates and streamlines regulatory agencies that make it easier to spot a really underperforming bank and then have these living wills. So allow a regulator or a group of businessmen who are identified by the regulator to step in and try and work that bank through its troubles or wind it down. So that's good. Limits on, didn't quite get to the end of that sentence. Limits on proprietary trading. So proprietary trading is trading with your own cash, as opposed to executing a trade on behalf of your client. So speculative trading was, you know, the order of the day in the 2000s. So what Volcker tried to do, so Volcker is he was a former Fed chairman and a really respected character in financial circles. So he wanted to just ban proprietary trading, so speculative trading by investment banks. And he got so much opposition from senators who were tight with the Wall Street lobby, basically. It made a lot of sense to me. But you've got this problem of trading for your clients. So say one of your clients comes to you and says, look, I've got $100 million worth of Indonesian rupiah exposure over the next 10 years. Can you hedge it for me? And you say, no worries, leave it with me. So then you've got to lay that risk off yourself, if you choose to, over the next 10 years. So at what point is that speculative or not? You know? So if I don't lay it off in the next day, does that mean I'm speculating? Or, you know, I don't want to sink the market for the rupee because it's not a particularly liquid market. So if I pile in and lay that off tomorrow, I'm going to make huge losses. So it makes sense to lay it off over months, if not years. Is that speculating? Because I carry some of that risk on my balance sheet. It's really grey at what point are you actually engaging in proprietary trading. So it's really tough to step in and say no more proprietary trading because there's some smart people there that will find ways around it. And of course fell short of the Glass-Steagall Act. So Glass-Steagall was the last Dodd-Frank. So after the Great Recession, they sat down and said, what can we do to stop this happening again? And what they said was, we're no longer going to let any institution that takes deposits from mums and dads engage in anything that's loosely investment banking. So either you're a mortgage provider, deposit gatherer, or you're an investment bank. And in the glory days of the Clinton years, 99, it's like, we don't have massive crises anymore. Let's get rid of that silly rule, you know? And so, yeah, this was another one. So there's a limitation in terms of what part of their Tier 1 capital. So Tier 1 is common stock and retained earnings. So the sacred cow of the balance sheet. So there's a limitation in how much of that can go into private equity and hedge funds. But goodness me, if you're in private equity and hedge funds, you can leverage up a long way without the regulator knowing. I think that's fraught with danger. But again, that started out, like the Dodd-Frank Act, that was going to be 0%. But as the weeks went by and the conversations grew, they were allowed to have 3%. Okay, just a really good quote. So my favourite book, if you want to know more about this, the one that was really well written by this guy, Andrew Ross Sorkin, Too Big to Fail. It's actually a really good read. Well, look, I'm a bit of a dork with this stuff, but I found that really interesting. If you want to find out more about how this all transpired, the events of September 2008, this guy was awesome. He did a great job. But this is a quote that I reckon sums up where we're at now. If you just take a moment to read. Genuine sense of humility. And look, you can put all the regulation in place in the world, but for me this is a cultural issue. You know, the arrogance that I came across when I walked into that investment bank back in '96, I was just amazed at how the trading floor. So I did the P&Ls and kept the risk positions for these guys. I was one of their servants, and I just couldn't believe how, like, I'd never seen such arrogant people in my life, and just the whole attitude to, like, your power within that organisation was just all about your P&L, and then there was your P&L was all about mark to market. So, for instance, a trader whose P&L I was keeping in Singapore, so he made about $100 million a year for the bank. And one of the products that he would put together with the marketers would be to hedge Indonesian rupiah out 20 years. So, so that's currency hedge as well as interest rate hedge. And what he'd do to get that would be take a massive upfront fee. It's like, okay, we'll hedge you, but you'll have to give me like $5 million tomorrow, and that hedge will be in place. So he hits his P&L budget, he gets his $3 or $4 million bonus, whatever it was. When he leaves the bank's still got that 20-year exposure, you know. So he's got his short-term P&L all in order, but the poor old shareholder is going to carry the can for the next 20 years if the route goes the wrong way. But that's one example, and I could give you dozens more of just really, really bad bonus systems that encouraged all the short-term behaviour. And you've probably heard this all before, short-term behaviour, and just poorly incentivised traders. But yeah, lack of humility. There was a quote from the now fired Bob Diamond, who was the CEO of Barclays, and he said, this was like maybe a year ago, he said something to the effect of, the time for apologising is over. You know? And it's as if, yeah, let's just go back to business as normal. And then like a couple of months later, there was the LIBOR scandal. So LIBOR, so that's the benchmark interest rate that sets trillions of dollars worth of mortgages around the world. So what had happened at Barclays and other investment banks is, you know, a trader in the fixed income, so these are the guys trading bonds where you might be short or long the LIBOR. And so if you can manipulate that rate at the end of the day, So it might be the end of the quarter and you're going to have your bonus determined in 2 days' time. You want to get your mark to market. You want those bonds to be looking as good as possible. So what had happened, at the end of the day, a trader would stand up and say, look, I want this benchmark rate to be a little bit lower today. Is everyone okay with that? And the way that LIBOR was set was like 10 different investment banks or whatever it was would, at the end of the day, they'd say, right, the rate we're paying to borrow funds from other banks is X. And so collectively, they would set that rate. And anyway, so this is the kind of culture. And it was just, yeah, so bonus was king. Yes, mate.
I'm glad you brought that up because that whole, I don't call it scandal or manipulation, they're saying it's affected over $500 trillion worth of dollars in the market.
Wow, wow.
And just because it's every single interest that could have been made if those interest rates had been higher up for the investor, for the person, or the person that was lending everything out.
Yeah.
And so I've talked to people who talk about the GFC and this or that, and I say, well, what about the LIBOR scandal? And it's almost one of those things that's too complex for a normal person who doesn't have the business experience to understand. They don't realize how big of an impact globally that had, and it actually makes some of these banking things pretty small in comparison.
Yeah,
but it's almost like it's just too hard to think about or to really understand or explain, and so it just kind of, it's really slipped under the curtain.
Yeah, absolutely. There were two angles there. One was the fact that they were manipulating it for their mark-to-market within the bank. The other one was, which was slightly more defendable, was the fact that they reckon, in the UK anyway, they reckon they had the word under the table from Mervyn King, the Fed equivalent in the UK, that they should push it up, push it down. So the higher it was, the more it looked like the banks were unstable. So they reckon they had tacit approval to keep it down. And that was, so that gave them a better platform to argue their position. But this idea that they were standing up at the end of the day and agreeing as a trading group, do we want to push it up or down today? It's just one of various things that you read about in terms of activities that have taken place at investment banks. It just makes you sick,
When you're investing money, you're thinking, well, I'm getting this return, and this is what I'm putting up my liquidity, my asset, in order to get that return.
Yeah.
But they're pretty much colluding, and we think, well, that rate must be set by somebody who's important and somebody who's calculated the whole rate, and I've got trust in that rate. And you're right. It's just a bunch of people saying, what's the rate today? It'd be great if it's a bit lower. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Just all for personal gain. Anyway, so good book, and that's my favourite quote of that book. Right, so I'm just going to list for you, so having discussed a little about what took place, there's about a dozen reasons that are commonly cited as the root cause of the crisis. So let's just go through a few. So Congress pushing home ownership, and you could argue like the Declaration of Independence that encourages property ownership, if you want to go far enough back. So Fed keeping interest rates low for so long. Predatory lenders for taking advantage of unqualified and vulnerable buyers. So those lenders were then quite often packaging their mortgages and selling them off to an investment bank. And so that's one of the key issues here. You weren't going to carry the can. You got your bonus as a mortgage provider, or your fee, on the basis of closing a deal. Didn't wear the consequences of it going wrong. And quite often, and what's emerging now is that they'd find like, someone in middle America who never thought they'd own like that home, and they'd start them out at like 1.5%, but in 2 or 3 years that would reset to 4.5%, and they wouldn't mention that fact. So they'd say, look, this is cheaper than living in the caravan for the next couple of years. Why don't you take this? But then it resets and it all goes wrong. Home buyers. So this is, I went to a mate's wedding a couple of years ago in Bermuda. So this was a guy I worked at the bank with, and he was in the heart of the whole trading thing. Really good bloke, but just will defend to the death the role of investment banks in this whole crisis. And he says, look, these home buyers, they were taking the money, and that's the most common way of clearing one's conscience, it appears, in the investment banking community. A White House for letting regulations become too loose. Finance executives. So, yeah, this is the investment bank side of things. So again, they got their bonus for closing that mortgage deal. You know, so if they put together a group of a portfolio of mortgages, sold it on, they got their fee for closing that transaction, despite the fact that they held a fair bit on their balance sheet, which eventually brought them unstuck. Mark-to-market accounting, as I said, yes, mate. Yeah. Well, I'll go through the sort of the pecking order of those that came out of this in terms of the P&L as opposed to ethically from probably the best position. So I'd start with Goldman Sachs. I mean, so when this was all taking place in September 2008, Warren Buffett bought like $10 billion worth of preferred shares from Goldman. They were probably the best, as I noted before, at environmental scanning and just saying what's going wrong here. The next one's probably JP Morgan Chase. Diamond is, or what's his name? Jamie Dimon, yeah. So he's probably got the best reputation with Congress and the Senate, you know, but that's been badly tainted in the last sort of year with the whale. I don't know if you heard about that. So he's taken a bit of a hit. So it probably goes Goldman, JP Morgan Chase. The next rung down, you've got a few Morgan Stanley and Credit Suisse. Probably came through it all right, not quite as well as the other two. And then it's all the rest, you know. So in terms of the different investment banks, yes, buddy.
So how come the other banks weren't looking at Goldman's and saying, well, how come these guys aren't, or were Goldman's not letting them go? They pulled out?
Yeah, look, no one really knew. They were trying to keep it to themselves that they were, and it would have become obvious, given that they eventually made $9 billion out of those trades, it would have become obvious if you were in those markets that Goldman were trying to execute these short trades. But there was a refusal to believe that the party was over by a lot of the other banks, given that there was, yeah, maybe. But
the Goldman, was that proprietary trading though? That was them using their own money to shoot the banks in their system?
Absolutely.
So.
So that trading profit was all proprietary. Yeah. So mark-to-market accounting, as I explained, it means that you get to take profit on your P&L and your bonus is calculated based on an unrealised trading position. The ratings agencies, geez, where do you start with these guys, you know? They've really copped it. And there was a great article the other day about S&P, so S&P, Moody's, two big ones. So S&P are now being accused again of, so they were, for a long time, they just had they've got a bad reputation, both them and Moody's, but they were losing business. So business to these guys is where an investment bank says, come in, I've got this collateralised debt obligation or mortgage-backed securities, can you come in and rate it? And so you're more likely to get the fee if you're going to give them a favourable rating. And so that's how that industry works, and nothing's changed. And so S&P are again being accused of giving away generous ratings to get the fee. So beware.
It's also reported that not only they're incentivised to get the fees, but also there were low-level, yes, professionals, but low-level bureaucrats who actually knew nothing about the products that they were rating. Is that also a view that you have?
Yeah, mate, that's a bit litigious, you know. So if that can be proved that there was a genuine incompetence issue, then they're in real trouble. And they've done well so far to not be taken to the cleaners legally. But that's certainly an accusation that's been made, and it's particularly thrown around at the political level. So in Europe, every time a country takes another downgrade, you know, Merkel or what's his name, Rajoy, are out in the press saying, no, you're all incompetent, you don't know what you're doing. So it's a claim that's made often, but yeah, it remains to be seen whether they can prove that they were careless and incompetent. Short selling hedge funds, so if you can short sell, you're more likely to be able to create a downward spiral for a particular stock price or bond or whatever it may be. And the transformation of investment banks. So there was a time when the most senior people in investment banks were partners like accounting firms, and they actually had cash at stake, whereas now their liability is limited. Yes?
So what's your view on short selling? Because it's, there's an upside to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is particularly controversial. So in some markets, for instance, like you can't short sell Greek bonds, for instance. And there was a period there where in Europe where you couldn't short sell investment banks, where they didn't want a run on that. Mate, I don't know that. I don't know the legalities or the intricacies of the market well enough to have a really informed opinion on that. So let me start by saying that. But you've got to, if you completely ban it, you then prevent people from protecting themselves if they're in a particular trading position that they have trouble getting out of otherwise. So it's dangerous to completely ban it. Yeah.
Information gets into the price of it.
Sorry, what's that?
If you take away short selling completely,
Yeah.
you remove the market mechanism of how market prices.
Yeah, good point.
security.
Yeah, good call. Yeah. Yes, mate. Yeah.
But for every short, you have to have a long. So if you take short out, it means you literally obliterate any type of hedging.
Yeah, okay.
All of your resources have to use it for currency hedging and other, which then in its own way
Yeah.
will bring the financial system to a halt.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. So, and look, I don't know enough about that whole debate to enter into it with gusto, so I'll leave it at that. Righto, so having gone through that, and what I want you to have a think about, oh, yes, sorry.
What about real wages? So in the US, real wages have probably risen since the 70s for the common people.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to get into that exec comp debate in a moment. It's a really good point in that whole, the ethics of compensation. I'll come to that in a moment, but good one. Righto, so just having had a look at all those, what I want you to have a think about is there a common theme and what can be done to prevent recurrence? So they're the big questions of the day. And if you achieve anything from this session, hopefully you'll have an informed opinion on what it is that may have caused this, and in your opinion, because there's plenty of opinions out there and no one's right, what was the most significant? And you know, if this comes up as a potential election issue, hopefully you'll be in a position to inform those around you a little bit more of what is at stake and what were the root causes. But is there a common theme? And what can be done to prevent recurrence? So please just park that and just process it over coming months, years, decades. So there's a regulatory angle here, and there's not much going on there. And that's probably, look, and this is subjective, but in my opinion, the fact that there's not a lot of regulation, as I said, I was disappointed with what Dodd-Frank delivered in the end, because I thought clearly laissez-faire hadn't worked for us, right? We've had a major issue. But as soon as you let politicians, who a lot of them aren't particularly sophisticated or well-educated in this stuff, as soon as you let them loose with this regulation, you don't know what you're going to get. And you get a lot of stuff that's watered down due to political lobbies or influenced by someone's ideological background or political issues. So I'm worried once the regulators really start to fire up. But every now and then a bit of legislation comes along that I think, oh, cool, you know. So for instance, with the pre-watered down Dodd-Frank. But then there's this business practice angle. And so this is what we can control as individuals and as senior business leaders. And so one way we can make a difference here is through the compensation angle. So I'm going to use this as a segue to now talk about exec comp. Because my observation is that a common theme that ran through all of those causes is perverse incentives, poorly designed incentive structures that haven't been well thought through. So, you know, you've got the middle America mortgage salesperson closing deals on the basis of the fact that someone accepts their mortgage because they don't care. Their compensation will not be affected if that person can't repay it.
Volume, not quality.
Yeah, yeah.
More stamps.
Sure.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that.
Then they offloaded it to a bank, and then the banks offloaded it to Wall Street.
Yeah, yep.
So everyone clipped their ticket along the way, and then around we go.
Yeah, absolutely. And eventually it was society and the global economic system that lost. Ratings agencies for getting a fee for offering a generous rating. the bonuses of investment banks based on deal completion and mark to market. So these are all about incentives. And what we see in this research, so having spent quite a few years now examining how different small tweaks in exec comp affects behaviours, there's so much extremely powerful evidence out there. And look, you see this day to day. If you change someone's bonus, what they get paid for, it significantly changes behaviours. So this is within your control in terms of how you negotiate your contract and how you negotiate the contracts with your subordinates. And so that's what I want to focus on for this last period. So as I said, this has really been in the spotlight. So pretty well all of the big folks, Obama, Geithner, the president of the EU, etc. In the last few years, they've pointed the finger squarely at executive compensation and short-termism encouraged by executive compensation as the root cause of the crisis. So short-termism, the use of stock options. So stock options is an interesting one. So it's kind of become a dirty word in the world of compensation. So basically, if you're a CEO, you're hired by a firm, you bring in your team of compensation consultants to negotiate your contract. And right now, you can't get, well, almost with the Fortune 500 companies, it's really tough to negotiate options in your contract. And why? Well, there's a lot of really, really powerful evidence out there to suggest that if I load you up with stock options, you're more likely to take excessive risk. And there's more likely to be negative, extreme negative P&L events. That's what the research tells us. So just to give you an example of the fact that it encourages risk-taking. So you've got nothing to lose in the beginning, but you'll get exponential gains from increases in the stock price. That's how options work. Whereas if I give you stock, you've got something to lose. So I give you $1 million worth of stock. You want to take care of that $1 million. I give you options, there's nothing to lose at the beginning. A really good example of how this affects behaviours. 2001, I think, was when Brian Gilbertson was announced as the CEO of the newly merged BHP and Billiton. So as part of his contract, he got awarded more options than any BHP executive in history. He was loaded up, ready to go. And so what he did in the next few months was went out and looked to buy Rio Tinto and Canadian Alcan. So why wouldn't he? He's got a lot to gain if this goes through those stock options. He's a risk taker at this point in time. So 6 months down the track, Don Argus, the chairman of BHP, says, "Whoa, hang on, we're not going to buy this. Geez, that's way too risky." And at the time, so this was 2001, Gilbertson was on record as saying, "Look, China's going to take off. This commodity market's got a long way to run. We need to leverage up." And the BHP's board's saying, "Too risky. We're not going to go there." So at that stage, they could have bought Rio Tinto for $50 billion. This is just a bit of an aside. And Rio Tinto now is valued at about $170 billion.
Rio's not, it's about a 40 billion.
40 billion?
Rio Tinto.
But they tried to buy it for $150 billion again, didn't they?
I know. Yeah, I know.
So
the market cap's about 40 billion for Rio Tinto. BHP's just a bit over 100 billion.
But didn't they bid 150 billion at one stage?
The stock price went up to about over 1.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. So that's where that's when they tried to buy it again, right? Yeah. Sorry. So they tried to buy it again for 3 times the price. So what's their market cap now? 40 billion, but they could buy it for.
Around 40 billion.
Righto.
Thereabouts. Yeah.
So if they wanted to buy it, they'd have to bid 100 right now, would they?
To
Is
buy
that?
it now?
Yeah.
Whatever it is, 20% premium, 25%.
So, but it's back to 40 billion, the market cap of Rio.
It's gone for a bit of a run because the iron ore price hasn't come off like a lot
Yeah.
of people were expecting.
Yeah.
And they're going to, I'm assuming they're going to outperform a bit.
Yeah.
But
Righto.
it's trading around
Righto.
50 billion.
Righto. So,
Anyway.
sorry. But my point.
It's a little bit off there with you.
Yeah, with my numbers. But my point here is that it encourages excessive risk taking. It then cost BHP $50 million for this guy to exit. So my point is, if you say you're in a stable industry, it's a mature industry.
Why market cap 111 billion for Rio Tinto?
111 billion. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, and thank you. So it was just a bit of an aside to say if you're a BHP shareholder, I'd be upset with the board for exiting Gilbert way back then. But sorry, Gilbertson. But my point is, if you want a CEO to come in and basically not take excessive risk, and this will depend on the stage of the product life cycle. You know, say you're a tech startup, yeah, bring him in, load him up with options. But if you're in a mature industry, you might have already made some acquisitions, you're concentrating on cost, don't give your CEO stock options. So there's the debate. Golden parachutes, this is another red flag. You know, so it's being rewarded for failure, basically. And it's another reason why I'd take excessive risk as a CEO, because if I fail, I don't care, I'm going to walk out on this golden pension. So golden parachutes are generally a bad idea, but you still see them popping up in compensation contracts. Righto, so having gone through, you know, what is going on in the world of compensation, yes?
Yeah, in terms of regulation, what do you, or just about to talk about that, but in Switzerland we have a vote in November about the 1 to 12 initiative.
Uh-huh.
So the lowest salary in your paying, less than a 12 of the highest salary that you're paying.
Wow, okay.
So that's actually passed all the regulatory stages that it's not going to be voted. Switzerland is like this big democracy, so we have to vote on everything.
So you're Swiss?
Yeah.
Oh, right, cool.
So in November we need to vote on whether or not we want to pass that.
Well, you're probably an expert on, like, I'm about to say, like, the Swiss have gone.
Yeah, but that's kind of the old one that they've had for.
Right, okay, so they're going further.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Going into salary, that's the actual
Yeah.
salary regulation.
Right, wow.
Also, I was wondering if, because a lot of people say, oh, it's probably not, like, we're not going to be able to actually write the law well enough, because we've touched on that before around, you can have regulations, but there's always so many loopholes.
Yeah.
As a general direction, I think it's an interesting concept to actually
Yeah.
go that way.
Absolutely, and the Swiss have certainly been leaders in this respect, so in terms of banning golden handshakes. And UK was the forerunner with this say on pay, so it's kind of, it's a bit lacking in substance. You can, as a shareholder group, say we disagree, but nothing can have to change, whereas in Switzerland it actually absolutely has to. And so I guess the rest of the world are looking to Switzerland to see how that affects behaviours over subsequent periods. But yeah, there's a particular left-wing politician, right, who's really pushing all this over there.
Well, not only one, it's
Quite a few.
left movements.
Yeah.
Because there are more and more people that come from the left wing that, with very, like, lots of social values that have basically gone through business school.
Right.
So it's kind of this thing that it's not anymore the left dignitaries that have no idea about the economy, but it's actually coming up with very feasible and very good models of how we could actually handle it and make it a fairer system.
Interesting, because he's come back when people were saying, look, this is going to affect foreign direct investment because people won't want to invest here if we can't attract the best CEOs. And this guy was coming back and saying, hey, well, actually, maybe this will attract investors because they can come here and have a larger say on exactly what the compensation contract's going to look like. So, yeah, he's not a silly guy. But, yeah, what else have we got? So the EU have this restriction where the bonus can't be bigger than the salary, and it can be twice as a maximum if 2/3 of the shareholders agree. So pros and cons of this. Well, a con here is that, say you've got a CEO and they've been paid about $5 million. And in the past, the way that's been structured has been, say, 1.5 or 1 million base, and then they get their other $4 million variable if they do well. So now, if that guy's expecting $5 million, you're going to have to pay him $2.5 million fixed. If he has a bad year, he still gets $2.5 million. So your fixed costs go up as an organisation, and they'll just game it. If you've got the money to pay that higher base, you can game this. So what happened 2009 in the investment banks, the MDs and directors all got like a 50% increase in their base salary, and that was because they didn't want that big press headline at the end of the year saying investment bankers pay bonus of X billion dollars. You know, so one of the inadvertent and possibly negative consequences here is that the fixed cost base of institutions and manufacturing firms and whatever else is going up. So the USA is possibly the least imposing of any of the developed countries. So they've got this non-binding say on pay. So the shareholders have the say, but you know, the institutional investors who dominate the shareholder registries of the Fortune 500 are pretty passive. You know, quite often they've got a good relationship with the big end of town, with the CEOs, etc. You don't see them arcing up a lot, with the exception of, you know, a Carl Icahn or some of the other CalPERS, the Californian-based organisation. So yeah, 2 out of the 250 largest organisations actually rejected the compensation report. And guess what? The report didn't change. So not much has happened there. So Australia basically has a US model with this additional thing of 2 strikes. Basically, if the shareholders can vote on a motion to dismiss the entire board, at 25% of the vote at 2 consecutive annual general meetings, then the board's dismissed. But so far that hasn't done all. Yes, mate.
But the flip side to that, and we're seeing it in the press,
Mm-hmm.
in the Australian situation, people are using that as an excuse to protest other measures. Oh, we don't like your investment strategy, or we don't like your ethical practices, so we'll just vote against the compensation.
Yeah, right.
Spill.
Right.
It's also happening in terms of activist shareholders, where they're just doing it to get their own way on another matter.
Just to aggravate it, becomes a portfolio of issues. Yeah, good point. Yeah. So that's a negative of, absolutely, it's a negative of that particular approach. But look, I guess you can argue that at least it's good that they can, provided it's not used perversely. You know, you can argue that it's a positive advancement, but it's not really achieving a lot, is my point. I don't think I've seen an example where, well, we've still got to get through the 2nd and 3rd annual general meetings since this was introduced, but it's not looking like it's going to have much of an impact on the way things are done. And the focus of the shareholders and the public debate has generally been upon the headline number. So I occasionally get a call from the press asking me to comment on, you know, so CEO X has been paid $5 million and there's been some negative press about this. What do you think? And my point is that the question shouldn't be about the magnitude of pay. And sure, magnitude is important, right? Because it's going to be representative of the degree to which this person earns their pay. But the question should be, how is that pay structured? You know, so for instance, would you invest in a company where this CEO is going to get $5 million every year and there's no long-term incentives? So no variable pay at all. Or for instance, you might have a situation where a CEO might get 2.5 million this year, and maybe he's going to get his remaining 2.5 over the next 10 years if the share price outperforms. You know, that's the kind of company that I'd invest in. And I want to know what kind of severance package is this person in line to get if things fail. Are they getting stock as well as options? If so, how much? What's the value of the options they're sitting on today? Because if I want this guy to take risk and he's sitting on a few $1 million worth of options, well, I'm not convinced that he's going to go out and shake the marketplace up. The CEO of Potash, the big potash producer in Canada, sitting on $400 million worth of stock options. Do you think he's going to go and do something dramatic in the market? So the only way that, if you wanted that company to get innovative and do something different, you'd probably need a different CEO. So the question needs to be more sophisticated than, is $5 million too much? I want to know, right, what did he do to deserve that? Maybe 2.5 million of that is a result of an investment he made 5 years ago. Good on him, deserves his $5 million, or deserves her $5 million. The Australian Institute of Directors has been quite vocal about, so there's excessive reporting requirements. Look, having worked as an auditor, so that was my first job back in '91, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot to verify the executive compensation packages of the top management team. You know, that's a very minor part of an audit, in my humble opinion. So there's obviously costs and benefits of any regulation, but in my opinion, the more information you're getting as an investor on how that CEO compensation is structured, the better. Unfortunately, you can't get a lot of information on their KPIs because it's deemed commercially sensitive, and fair enough. But I really think that anything in the press where they say, you know, there's way too much disclosure, you know, we want less transparency with executive compensation. Basically, that's what the Australian Institute of Company Directors, that's their line. I just don't buy it, you know. Like, the more you can learn about these comp structures, the better. Yeah, basically, Enron, I don't know if anyone's read the Enron story. It was another one that I've analysed from time to time. Basically, the M&A team there got their bonuses for closing deals. So they bought that power station in India for whatever it was, billions of dollars. So there was an incentive to overpay because I got my bonus when I closed the deal. There's nothing about how that performed over the long run. Yeah, Citigroup, so like Chuck Prince, the guy with that golden quote about I'll keep dancing till the music stops. So he walked away with $150 million. That was his severance package, despite the fact that the organisation he left behind had failed because of his stewardship. You know, so absolutely appalling, all of this. Yeah, yeah.
A bit aggressive, I know, but
Yeah.
is there any examples of, say, base salary, performance pay, bonus for performance, dock of pay, or you underperform?
Clawback.
I know it's aggressive, but is that,
Yeah,
is that
mate,
possible?
it's really pushed back. You don't see a lot of that. What you call is clawback. So clawback can only take place generally if there's been some kind of a material misstatement of profit. So, but it's generally not because of subsequent underperformance. The only way you can do it is basically say to him, okay, so your variable pay was going to be $1 million this year. I'm going to give you 20% of that today, and I'm going to give you the other 80% over the next 5 years based on what happens with the share price. So that's the best we can do. So here's the question. So instead of is this person being paid too much, here's the questions that I think we should be asking in this whole compensation debate. How much of his pay is, or her pay is variable? You know, what are the KPIs? So if I was on a board of directors, the first thing I'd be doing is, or one of the first things I'd be doing, is having a look at the compensation contracts of the top management team. So a former client of mine as a strategy consultant, they were a multinational. Whenever I've got anything negative to say about a former client, I won't say their name because it's litigious reasons. But so basically, their operation in Europe, the sales director was compensated on gross sales. And that was fine when they were the market leader and they could just sell more of anything and it was all profitable. But as soon as the foreign competition started to really eat away at their customer base and they became unprofitable, this guy had no incentive to start pushing more innovative, higher profit margin products, which were the key to their survival. And when you tried to make this case to the board, that look, the fact that we can't transform the culture of this company to a more innovative company is blocked by the compensation structure, or sorry, the compensation contract of that sales director. But the sales director was probably the second most powerful individual in the organisation, so nothing changed. And as a result, you just couldn't get the sales team to change focus to the products that could potentially save the business. And that business has now pulled out of Europe, and none of those people have a job anymore. But these are the kind of questions that are really important for you to ask if you're ever invited to be on a board, and just important things to focus on with your own compensation contracts, just making sure that your bonus is reflective of the strategy of the firm. I'll get onto a potential pay structure before we finish up. But anyway, what else? Yeah, is it consistent with the risk profile of the firm? As I said, you probably don't want to give stock options to a business that's mature stage. But not so bad if you're a startup and you need to get out there and make some big product innovation moves. Long-term performance is a key as well. And this clawback provision, so that's golden, but not a lot of firms have it. So at a minimum, I'm going to take the money back from you if that bonus was calculated on the basis of a number that was wrong in the first place. So just getting to your question now. So the other question, so one is this structure and incentives, and as I said, that's really important. And one of the takeaways for today, hopefully for all of you, is to have a really good look at any of the compensation contracts of those below you. But I just want to tap you in before I leave as well on just this debate going on in society at large about the relative magnitude of CEO pay or executive pay. So there's a few different lines out there in terms of, is this justified or not? I'm just going to take you through it, so I'll leave it to you to form an opinion. So just start with some stats. So USA 2012. So 2012 average CEO comp was 15.1 million, which was 5 million in cash. This is the US, by the way. I always have trouble getting similar stats on Australia. So 5 million in cash, stock option grants are 9 million. So they're doing all right. You don't have to take the hat around. And that was a 16% increase in the prior year. It's pretty good, hey? Top 5 doubled their pay on the prior year, so that's a top 5. Maybe they deserved it, I don't know. And the top management team, so their direct reports to the operating committees, weren't far off it. An average stock holding of a CEO, it was the top 200, it was 50 million bucks. Long-term incentive plans usually consisted of 50% stock, so the other 50% was cash or options. And what do we got? So as I said, options have become a bit of a dirty word in this space. They've got a bad name. Variable pay is mostly linked to return on equity. And just as an example of a really good, innovative KPI, so 3M includes a measure based on innovation. Because what you really want to do is try and find lead indicators. So we can't compensate you today based on how we're going to perform in 5 years, but we know historically that like customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, the development of your staff, the retention of your staff are all lead indicators of performance or investment in R&D. So these are the kind of things that, the questions that should be asked about how are my CEOs compensated as if I'm an investor. So on pay increases, so in 1980, CEO pay was 42 times the national average, but in 1990 it was 107, 2000, 525. So it got out of hand, hey? In the 1990s, there was a critical Senate committee hearing where Jensen and Murphy, two prominent economists, basically put a case to the American Senate that we need to provide tax breaks for stock options because stock options are good. We need, so they're economists, they believe CEOs should take more risk. Bottom line, they should be incentivised to take risk. So that was the line sold to the Senate. And as a result, in the 90s, they all started to get a whole lot of stock and stock options. And then you had the bull market of the late 90s. And so that was the main catalyst. And then that created a benchmark. Despite that a lot of their pay was in options, it was like, okay, a good CEO gets paid, what, 15 million bucks? And it was kind of lost that that 15 million bucks was due to a bull market that had nothing to do with their performance. So, as I said, shift to stock and options through the golden 90s. The gaming of stock and options rewards. So a lot of CEOs have got in trouble over this one, but if you know you're going to announce a merger in, say, 2 weeks' time, you'll make sure that the date that you get your options, because your options, the exercise price for those options will be generally the day they're awarded. So you make sure you game it. If there's going to be a positive announcement, you game it so that you get your options before that announcement. Compensation consultants. So compensation consultants go in and they basically, like, almost without exception, they will say, this is a top quartile performer. They will not work for you unless they're paid in the top quartile. So comp consultants that I catch up with occasionally, they have these massive databases where they keep the stats so that they can say to a board of directors, you know, the top quartile here is about, you know, X million. That's what you need to pay this person. And so there's not a bottom quartile of performers anymore, you know, so it just keeps ratcheting up. And no board wants to concede that they've just done this massive search to get anything but a top quartile performer. And the CEO power within the board, that's often cited. CEOs often have a big say in who is appointed to the board of directors. The board of directors will come around to their place for dinner quite often, you know. So these kind of things. There's a lot of political influence of the board, such that they don't want the board to block that next request for a pay increase. And the war for talent. I mean, anyone, like, as you probably know, like, if you're trying to hire someone senior, it's really tough to get the right person. And when you do find that person, you don't want to lose them due to a negotiation mishap. And so basically, particularly during that 90s when these benchmarks were set, it was just so hard to get the right person, still is, but their power in that negotiation is significant. So just quickly, there's this guy Kaplan. He went before the American Senate recently and said, no problem, there's no problem with this whole CEO compensation thing, let it continue. And basically, he said it's all about market forces, let the market roll. You know, he said, look at the pay of athletes and actors. They're all making lots of money as well, they're talented. Why shouldn't CEOs? So this guy, this is from the University of Chicago, which is the home of the laissez-faire neoclassical economist. So he was never going to say anything else. Yeah, he's saying CEO turnover was higher in the last 10 years than it was in the 70s. In the 70s, it was terrible. No one was fired. So it was a really bad argument, I thought, to make. So John Bogle, there's a couple of economists. So there's Chicago, which is neoclassical, friends with the Tea Party, you know, and then there's the Stanford sociologist-based business school, and you get blokes like John Bogle. So Bogle's saying, yeah, basically corporate profits have tracked GDP. It's not due to the talent of these people. And celebrity and entertainers are paid directly by someone who likes what they're doing, whereas CEO is paid by a board who is influenced politically, who answers very, very indirectly to some shareholders. And he says there's lack of board accountability due to the fact that institutional managers are pretty indifferent. They step back. He says, so Kaplan was saying that a lot of CEOs lost a lot of money during the crisis. You know, a lot of them still took home tens of millions. It was crazy. Yeah, Stanley O'Neill from Merrill Lynch, you know, he pocketed over $300 million. And his bank lost tens of billions of dollars and would have failed to exist except for a generous bailout, you know. James Walsh, he's the daddy of the sociologists from business schools, and he's a bit of a character. He's a poet, an artist, and all of these things. But he basically says that CEO pay is about legitimacy. Like any other prominent group in society, you've got to come across as legitimate. The rest of society needs to approve of your place in the world. And he says that he basically cites the fact that the bourgeois revolutions of, you know, was that the 18th century suggests that society isn't sustainable with these massive disparities of income. And he makes a really good case. He wrote this article where he basically took Kaplan apart on various fronts. And as I said, like, this is subjective. You know, your opinion of whether you're behind Walsh or Kaplan depends on what part of the political divide you're from. I'm just letting you know what the debate is out there. So, as I said, he's asking, is it sustainable to have this disparity? And variance in the performance of an organisation accounts for less than 5% than the variance in CEO pay. So there's a really bad relationship historically between magnitude of CEO pay and firm performance, which sets in motion all these thoughts about the fact that there's political processes at play in setting exec comp. So here you go. So these are deciles of performance. So here's the highest performer, here's the lowest performer. So for some reason this fourth decile is only paid like about 20% less than someone who's achieving a six times higher return. Anyway, work that out. So, okay, so just recapping. So I just wanted us to have a think about the crisis, where it came from, what's happened since, and then I was trying to bring that exec comp angle in to give you something very directly that you can influence in your organisations, in the negotiation of your own contract, that you can question in firms that you invest in the future. And hopefully, as you develop more opinions on, you know, whether it be what the model contract should look like, how much should CEOs be paid, hopefully you've got an informed basis for those opinions now. Your senior business leaders, you're in a position to shape this debate in Australian society, and certainly in the organisations you work for. So as I said, very little has really changed from a regulatory angle. So the onus is really on you, on our business leaders, I think, to make changes in your organisation to disincentivise careless risk taking and incentivise sound business practice. And look, that's a big balloon in the sky. It's an aspirational goal, but that's what you've got to aim for. And I'd be far more comfortable if you, as well-educated, responsible business leaders, were making those changes than a bunch of poorly informed regulators with political influences. Just finally, I'm just going to throw an idea out there for you in terms of how you might structure. So let's say someone working for you is earning 150 grand. So say you give them fixed 100, 30 grand about their individual KPIs, the things they have complete control over. But then there'll be team goals, and then there'll be the overall firm goals. And you don't want to leave those two out because you don't want them to forget about helping everyone else in the team. But that's just a potential structure. Whether that's good or bad or not will depend on the person's personal risk tolerance. You know, maybe you just force this upon them. But if this is not a risk taker, maybe you might say to them, look, how about I give you 120 grand fixed? But if you're not going to accept this variable pay part, I'm going to cap your maximum pay at 130 grand. You're only going to get 10 grand as variable. So if you're going to give them more certain pay, you give them less maximum overall pay. Just a framework that I throw around. But I think that's my time. So thanks very much for your attention, and good luck.